I have a hypothetical question for you. Would you rather deal with a bed bug infestation in your home or endure years of being stalked and haunted by a skinwalker? Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. You can follow me on X, formerly Twitter, at @darkprevails. Today's episode is packed with bone-chilling stories of the unknown, including a skinwalker haunting that spanned years from someone's childhood, a strange witchcraft creature lurking in the forests of Maine, and more. If you have a story to share, submit it at darkstories.org. And if you'd like to access bonus content and help us grow into the biggest and scariest show out there, become a member at ec.com/plusus. Don't forget to follow and leave a review for Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you for your support. Now, let's get started. Story: Reservation Memories by Coley. I was born in the spring of 1989 into a family deeply rooted in Navajo heritage. Though we didn't live in the central region of the Navajo Nation, our home was on a smaller section of reservation land in northern Arizona. My father's side of the family had resettled there decades ago for reasons they rarely discussed. Whenever I asked about it, my father would simply call it a family matter, which was enough to shut down further questions. Growing up, I took the land around me for granted. There were vast open fields that eventually merged into clusters of juniper and pinyon trees. The winters were mild, but the summer heat was relentless. One prominent feature of the land was a winding wash that cut through the southern edge of the reservation. Everything felt timeless, as though it had always been that way and always would be. In 1999, I turned 10 years old, and that's when this story begins. My memories of that year are unusually vivid, likely because the events that unfolded left a lasting mark on my childhood. My mother was a staunch believer in traditional Navajo teachings. She'd grown up near the Four Corners region, and though we rarely ventured far from our corner of northern Arizona, we had family scattered across several states. My father worked for the tribal council, organizing youth programs and cultural events, while my mom helped manage a small convenience store attached to a gas station on the reservation. We weren't wealthy, but we weren't struggling either. Our lives were simple. I had an older sister, Ava, who was 13 at the time, and a younger brother, Peter, who was 5. Our home was a modest double-wide trailer enclosed by a chain-link fence. Beyond the fence lay a mix of open fields, scraggly brush, and clusters of trees, what some locals called the woods, though they weren't very dense. About a quarter-mile from our yard, there was a wide arroyo that would fill with water after heavy rains, but remained dry most of the year. Past the arroyo, the land dipped into a shallow valley, offering a view that stretched for miles if you stood on a slight rise behind our trailer. It was around September of 1999 when strange rumors started spreading through our small community. People whispered about bizarre footprints and mutilated animals, mostly strays or wild critters, found near the reservation's edges. At first, these stories weren't taken too seriously. Our land is home to coyotes and occasionally stray dog packs. Rarely, someone would report a mountain lion attack on animals, though that was considered very unusual. But these stories didn't align with the behavior of typical predators. People claimed that the animals had been torn apart in ways that suggested something far more deliberate, something almost human. Tribal police filed a few reports, but no culprit was ever identified. At first, I didn't give it much thought, but then my father started locking our gate at night, something he had never done before. He also insisted that we keep our curtains drawn after dark. My mother began lighting juniper bundles and walking around the house, softly chanting prayers in the Navajo language. Ava and I were curious, but we didn't ask too many questions. Our mother's spiritual practices were strong, and it wasn't unusual for her to perform these little ceremonies, sometimes because of a bad dream someone had or after hearing about a tragedy in the community. But this time, there was an unshakable tension in our home that never really went away. I remember one night, about a week after the rumors began, when I heard scratching sounds coming from the outside wall near my bedroom window. My window faced the backyard, which led to the fence and then opened up into the fields. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like nails scratching against metal. I remember freezing in place, terrified, but straining to listen. After a few seconds, the scratching came again, slower this time, almost as if it was exploring. I was too scared to move. Eventually, the noise stopped, but I stayed awake for another hour, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I tried convincing myself it was just a stray cat or maybe a branch brushing against the trailer in the wind. However, the way my father acted the next morning made me doubt that explanation. I watched him walk the perimeter of our yard with a flashlight, even though the sun had already risen. He didn't say much, just kept inspecting the fence line. When I asked him if something was wrong, he looked at me with a serious expression. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said. "Just make sure you stay inside after dark." By October, the rumors around our community had gotten worse. Two teenage boys from another family claimed they had seen something stalking them on their way home from the bus stop at dusk. They described it as a tall figure with distorted proportions, moving on all fours at one moment, then standing upright the next. Their parents scolded them for making up stories, but the boys insisted they were telling the truth. Ava, who was friends with the older sister of one of the boys, told me what she had heard when no one else was around. "They swear its eyes glowed orange," she said. "Not like a reflection, actual light." That detail stuck with me. Around that time, our mom's nightly smudging routine became more elaborate. She started placing small pouches of corn pollen on our windowsills and door frames. She taught us a few basic Navajo prayers and insisted we recite them every night before bed. My sister complied, so I followed along, and even my little brother Peter repeated the words, thinking it was some kind of game. Meanwhile, my father became quieter than ever. He spent his evenings reading old texts and letters, which I suspected had come from relatives deeper in the Navajo Nation. Though he never shared much with us, I once caught a glimpse of some old printouts, possibly stories or records from our tribal lore. One cool autumn evening, I saw it for the first time. It was late 1999, maybe early November. The nights were cold, and the sky was so clear you could see an endless expanse of stars. I was supposed to be asleep, but I had sneaked out of bed to get a glass of water. As I walked through the dark hallway, I passed a window that looked out onto our front yard. The curtains were partially drawn, but through the gap, I could see outside. That's when I noticed it. Something was standing near the gate by the fence. At first, I thought it was a tall man in a heavy coat, but the shape wasn't quite right. It was hunched over, with a neck that was too long and arms that hung at odd angles. It stood just outside the reach of the porch light, making it hard to see its face. I froze, holding my breath. The figure turned its head slowly, deliberately, like it was scanning our windows. My heart pounded, and every instinct in me screamed not to make a sound. Then it took a step forward, and part of its shoulder caught the light. Its skin, or fur, was a patchy mix of gray and brown. It wasn't wearing any clothes. This wasn't a person. The figure sniffed the air, or at least it seemed like it. Its head tilted slightly, as if trying to catch a scent. Then it turned and retreated, moving in a way that was both smooth and unsettling, like a puppet with tangled strings. I watched it disappear into the darkness beyond the fence. I couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told Ava what I had seen. Her eyes widened as I described it. "Is that even possible?" she whispered, her voice trembling. We debated whether to tell our parents and eventually decided to speak with our mom alone. She listened without interrupting, her face serious. When I finished, she nodded and placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's important not to give it too much power," she said. "We must protect ourselves with prayer and caution." Then she surprised us by sharing some old Navajo beliefs. She spoke of individuals who could transform into animals or wear their skins to move unseen. She didn't use the term Skinwalker, but I recognized enough from the whispers and rumors I'd heard growing up. Mom cautioned us not to talk about it openly, not even to dwell on it too much. Even thinking about it can invite negativity, she said. She gave us small protective charms to wear and told us to keep them on at all times. Life went on, but the fear lingered. We still went to school and did our chores, but as soon as night fell, every door and window in our house was locked. In the community, people didn't talk about it much, only a few whispers here and there about odd sightings. The older folks would exchange knowing glances, silently agreeing not to stir the pot. My father worked with the tribal police, but no official statements were made. It felt like a quiet, collective fear had settled over the reservation, and everyone decided to endure it in silence. As the year 2000 began, not much changed. Sightings continued, though less frequently. Occasionally, someone would find strange footprints around their home, footprints that seemed part human, part animal. A few families reported hearing eerie chanting at night, carried across the open land. Mom became even stricter about not going outside after dark unless it was an emergency. We listened. Ava struggled the most, as she was used to meeting friends in the evenings, but even she obeyed. Dad increased his protective measures, sprinkling ashes around the perimeter of our yard. On certain nights, my father would sprinkle ash along the property line, keeping watch until dawn. One evening in March 2000, he rushed back into the house, locking the doors and shutting all the curtains. He gathered us in the living room and told us to stay absolutely quiet. Through the silence, we heard guttural howls rising and falling outside, echoing through the darkness like twisted, mocking laughter. My younger brother Peter began to cry, terrified. My mother held him close, whispering softly in Navajo, urging him to be brave. The sounds continued for what felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably no more than 5 minutes. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. My father told us not to move until morning. The next day, we found fresh claw marks on the front door, deep, splintering gouges in the wood. My father pressed his hand against the marks, his face tight with concern. My mother burned sweetgrass and prayed with an intensity one had never seen before. Even Ava, who usually tried to act tough, was visibly shaken. It became clear to all of us that whatever this was, it wasn't a random animal passing through. It was deliberate. It wanted us to know it was there, and it had come dangerously close to getting inside. As time passed, some families decided to leave temporarily, staying with relatives in nearby towns or deeper within the Navajo Nation. Others, like my parents, chose to stay, refusing to abandon their homes. My father felt obligated to the community, and my mother believed fleeing would only give this entity more power to haunt us. By late 2000, the strain was taking a toll on everyone. We were exhausted from sleepless nights and the constant tension. Ava began having nightmares, dark, vivid dreams of a shadowy figure looming over her bed, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. She described its eyes as red, not orange like the boys had claimed. My mother did everything she could to comfort Ava, offering herbal teas and performing more elaborate ceremonies. But the nightmares persisted. Ava became withdrawn, her once vibrant personality dimmed. Her teachers noticed the change and suggested counseling, but my parents didn't trust outsiders to handle what they saw as a deeply spiritual issue. In Navajo tradition, illnesses can be spiritual as well as physical or mental. So my mother called on a family relative, a respected spiritual practitioner, to help. This elder arrived in mid-2001, a quiet and composed woman who performed a protection ceremony. She sang for hours, using sacred herbs and offering prayers for our safety. During her prayers, The atmosphere in our home shifted. Warmth seemed to fill the space, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief, as though a heavy weight had been lifted. For a while, things improved. The scratching noises, the howls, the strange footprints, all of it decreased noticeably. But by early 2002, the disturbances returned. It began with our neighbor, an elderly man, discovering his chicken coop torn apart one night. Over a dozen chickens had been killed, their remains scattered in a disturbingly deliberate, almost ritualistic pattern. The man was distraught, convinced it was the work of witches or someone practicing dark magic. Not long after, a high school girl reported seeing a figure on the roof of the community center at dusk. She described it as tall and gaunt with an animalistic face. She screamed, but by the time others looked, it was gone. Rumors began swirling again. Some said it was a Skinwalker, a shapeshifter from Navajo lore. Others thought it might be someone using black magic to terrorize the community for reasons no one could understand. The elders continued to warn us, don't speak of it, don't dwell on it. Protect yourselves and stay indoors at night. In the summer of 2002, we hosted a family gathering. Relatives from out of state visited, filling our home with laughter and warmth. For a brief moment, it felt like life was normal again. One evening, my cousin Alec, who was my age, suggested we explore the arroyo nearby. I hesitated but agreed, thinking it would be safe as long as we returned before nightfall. We took Peter with us, walking along the dry riverbed and searching for interesting rocks. It felt good to be carefree for a while, just kids being kids. But then Alec froze, staring at something in the distance. Following his gaze, I saw it too. On the crest of a small rise, about 50 yards away, stood a figure. This time, in broad daylight, I could see it more clearly than ever before. Its tall, lanky limbs were wrapped in ragged animal skins, and its face was obscured by shadows. Even so, I felt its cold, unblinking stare. A wave of terror gripped me. I grabbed Peter's hand and took a step back. Alex stood motionless, his mouth hanging open. Then the figure raised an arm, as if pointing at us or beckoning. Dread overwhelmed me, stronger than anything I'd ever felt. We turned and ran, pulling Peter along as we stumbled over the uneven ground. We didn't stop until we were back in our yard, out of breath and trembling. My mother, who had been hanging laundry outside, saw our faces and immediately ushered us inside. We told her what had happened, tears streaming down Peter's face. Without hesitation, she lit sage and performed another prayer, giving us a special tea to calm us. By 2003, the entire reservation was on edge. Some families contacted state authorities, but they found no evidence, no footprints, no signs of unusual activity, and no suspicious individuals. Many families were hesitant to share details with outsiders, especially about spiritual beliefs, so nothing came of it. The cycle continued. There would be eerie events, sightings, noises, disturbances, followed by periods of uneasy silence. One night in late 2003, I remember my father stepping onto the porch with his rifle. He had heard a low chanting sound drifting across the fields. After a few minutes, he fired 2 warning shots into the air. The chanting stopped. My mother was furious, warning him that it might provoke something worse. But my father, visibly exhausted, gripped the rifle tightly. "We can't let it roam freely anymore," he said. "We have to show we can fight back, or it'll never leave us alone." Whether his show of force helped or not, the chanting didn't return for weeks. We savored the brief calm, though we never let our guard down. By 2004, I was 14. Ava was 17, preparing to leave for college far from northern Arizona. She had grown into a quiet but determined young woman, still carrying the scars of her nightmares. Peter was 10 now, a cheerful child by day but anxious once darkness fell. In early spring, my father learned of a large spiritual ceremony being held deeper within the Navajo Nation. It was meant to combat the negative forces plaguing several families. Though we couldn't attend, we participated from afar, observing stricter prayers and rituals over 3 days. On the second night, I was awakened by barking dogs and voices shouting outside. Rushing to the window, I looked out into the distant field and saw our fence flashlights bobbed at least 3 beams of light swept across the grass. I couldn't see details, but it was clearly a group of men searching for something. A muffled gunshot rang out. My father burst into my room telling me to stay put. He went outside to join them carrying his rifle. Later, I found out they'd seen the figure, a tall shape, loping through the darkness heading toward the tree line. One of the men fired, but it disappeared. They tracked footprints for 100 yards. Footprints they swear changed shape halfway through, as if human feet gave way to large paw prints. The trail ended abruptly near a rocky outcrop. No blood, no body, nothing, but there was an overpowering stench that made the men recoil. Father came home looking grim, but with a hint of defiance in his eyes, as if telling me we faced it, and we didn't run. That was the last major incident that I can remember. Over the next few months, sightings dwindled. Occasional odd noises or fleeting shapes, yes, but the full-scale terror that had dominated our community began to subside. By the end of 2004, many families breathed easier. Some credited the combined spiritual efforts. Others said it was just time for the malicious force to move on, and others believed the men that night might have wounded it enough to weaken its hold. Even if no blood was found, nobody knew for certain. For me, that entire stretch of years from 1999 to 2004 felt like living in a prolonged nightmare that ebbed and low, but never entirely released us from its grip. The day I turned 15, I remember my mother quietly saying, "We should be grateful it's calmer now. But never forget what has happened here." She wasn't just talking to me, she was talking to all of us, reminding us to never forget the power of old stories, the reality they hold even in modern times. She wanted us to never forget that there are forces out there that defy logic, and that caution, respect, and spiritual fortitude might be the only defense to. Over the years that followed, my family's life stabilized. Ava left for college, returning only during holidays, and she seemed to reclaim some of the light-hearted spirit she lost. Peter grew into a curious teenager, always asking about those years, but never quite remembering them fully. My mother and father never stopped performing small protective rites, though they scaled back the intensity. Once the reservation returned to relative peace, our old chain-link fence around the yard remained, but my father replaced our wooden front door with a sturdier metal one when he could afford it, still bearing faint scars from the night of the claw marks. Even though we found a kind of normalcy, the memory of that creature and what it represented has never left me. When I drive through that part of northern Arizona or walk along the Arroyo, I feel a slight chill, recalling the day I saw it in daylight. The elders say that once you've been marked by a supernatural presence, a part of it lingers in your awareness, even if you never see it again. Sometimes I wonder if that presence was truly an external being, or if some of it came from our own collective fears. But then I remember those unexplainable footprints, the guttural house owls, the claw marks on our door, and I know it was more than just imagination. Night Watcher from FW. Faceless. I'm a resident of Kentucky. I've been here all my life. It wasn't very unusual for freaky things to happen to me, Lord no, but some of the stuff that did happen confused me and often left me sleepless. One night when I was young, maybe 7 or 8, my brother and I sometimes shared bunk beds. He had them taken apart, so it was 2 twin-sized mattresses on each side of the room. I slept on the right side and my brother slept on the left. Now, I'd always kept a fear of the dark, not because I can't see or anything, it's more so because you never know what could be lurking in there. And of course this fear was 10 times worse as a child. I remember that night my brother had told me he was going to sleep, and we shared our good nights and I love yous. However, I couldn't go to bed because I'd been up that entire night prior and slept the following day away. So as any child would, I got on my phone and shut off the lamp between my brother and I began to watch YouTube to hopefully get to sleep. I remember vividly what I was watching, a video of my favorite YouTuber at the time playing a video game called Frambo. Eventually my eyes grew heavy and I passed out before that. I made sure to put my phone on the charger. At some point I woke up in the middle of the night. The lamp was on and my brother was still asleep. I couldn't really make sense of everything because I had just woke up, but I remember the light almost blinding me with how it shined. I blinked a few times, regaining my vision, and soon my eyes darted over to the white, skinny, small creature that had placed itself on the edge of my brother's bed. I made eye contact with it. The arms seemed to have no muscles at all. Heck, the thing didn't even have a mouth, just two small dots for nostrils and big hollow black eyes. Whenever I began to get up, the creature said hurried over to my side of the room, but instead of going onto the edge of my bed, it sunk beneath it. I froze in fear, unsure of what to do or say. I wanted to wake my brother up, but I couldn't. I laid back down, shut the lamp off, and went asleep. How did I manage to do that? I'm unsure. I was a ballsy and very cocky kid back then, and still half asleep, so I guess that's probably how, even though I thought it was safe to go back to bed, I was woke up again with the lamp on. However, this time, it was almost like I'd suffered from sleep paralysis. I couldn't speak, I couldn't move, I couldn't do anything, and that very same creature sat on the edge of my bed staring down at me. I wanted to push, shove, kick, scream, or cry, anything, but I just couldn't move. I genuinely thought I was going to die. I didn't know what to do. I began to panic, but again, there was nothing I could do. The creature just looked at me as if it was going to grow a gaping mouth and swallow me whole like it's dinner for the night. I remember running through every possibility in my head of what could happen to me, but nothing did. It seemed like I'd fallen asleep again, but I immediately woke back up. Everything was normal, just as I'd left it. The lamp was off, my brother was sleeping, and most importantly, there was no white creature anywhere in sight. I quickly got up anyway, checking underneath our beds, searching through the closets, bathroom, the house, literally everywhere. I couldn't even fathom what had happened to me, so I just pushed it aside and let it be for a few years. I'm older now and think back on this event. I've had people tell me stories similar to that of this creature, some even comparing it to a creepy pasta legend called the rake. I wasn't so sure about that, but I did research it and it did match up quite a bit, but I brushed it off, hoping that it was no big deal. Around the ages of 7 or 8, I began to wet the bed. It was very embarrassing for me, and I had no idea why it was happening. I was grown enough to not pee in the bed, but it happened a few months after that. I was getting ready to go to bed one night, but this time in my own room. I had a twin-sized bed at the time positioned right next to my door. I got comfortable, took a deep breath, had my TV on, and eventually fell asleep. But then something woke me up. That same creature was there this time, sitting right beside my head, staring at me. I couldn't move or speak or anything, just like last time, though it didn't have a mouth. I still heard it say something I can't quite recall, but I do know it was some sort of threat, like a warning of some sort. After that event, I actually stopped wetting the bed, and the creature never appeared before me again. I told my family about the experience, but they said I was just a kid with a big imagination. To this day, I'm so confused about it and have no way to explain the phenomenon that happened to me. The important lesson I would take away from this would be to definitely triple check everything before you lie down to sleep. You never know who or what is lurking in your home. Something was going on at that farm. From the Toggle 921, the collection of strange events or encounters I'm about to recount about a farm my family used to have may not be the most terrifying experience of wendigos or werewolves or ghosts, but are 100% true, though it is important to note that they did not occur only to me but to several people, and whose stories I will share to the best of my knowledge. Firstly, I need to describe the farm in which these events transpired, located in the more rural areas of northwestern Colombia. My family used to own a sizable farm which sat near a mid-sized town. Though the buildings of the farm itself were not that big, the land was vast, extending from the main road into the upper outskirts of the town, made up of either grass fields used for grazing or small patches of native forest. It was not an isolated place by any means. Communication with both the road and town was easy, and we had relatively close neighbors for the most part. It was a lovely place when we were kids, and whenever we went, my sister friends who would occasionally come along, and I would play all day long. However, whenever nightfall came, we all agreed that there was something chilling about the way the darkness enveloped the farm. It would always feel pitch black outside, even when the moon was out, and that may sound like a childish exaggeration, but it really felt that way. In fact, every time we promised ourselves we'd go camping in the fields just for fun at night, we would eventually chicken out when the sun fell, and run back to the farm building. That being said, true uneasiness of the farm really began with the first two occurrences. One happened to me, and another happened to a friend. They happened close and date because it was at a time where that friend, I'll call them Ben, was staying at the farm one night. Ben could not properly sleep. It was around midnight, a little bit past, and he decided to go for a walk out to a small set of stables which sat near the main farm building. The stable lights were always turned on, so when he walked out and looked into the stables and at the horses, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. There he saw the tail of one of the horses being braided, but when he appeared to see who was doing it, there was no one there. The tail was being seemingly braided on its own. He stared in disbelief for a few moments before quickly walking back to bed, feeling creeped out the rest of the night. The next morning he told us of this experience, and though my sister and I did not really pay mind to it, we thought about it for the rest of the day. What I didn't know is that the next occurrence was about to get real close to me. A few nights later, when I was sleeping at around 3 a.m., I heard heavy footsteps outside my window. I'm a light sleeper, so it immediately woke me, but I thought it was nothing, so I kept my eyes shut. However, the footsteps continued, and from the best of my hearing abilities, it appeared to be walking in a kind of circling movement right outside my window. My heart was pounding, but I still didn't open my eyes, and suddenly the footsteps stopped right at the panel of the window. I could now faintly hear a heavy sort of breathing or grunting sound, as if someone or something was standing and looking right at me through the glass. My heart was racing. I was completely immobile. Either I couldn't open my eyes or I didn't want to, because I feared that if I did, I would see something that would terrify me for the rest of my days, or somehow worse, staring at me. Instead, I kept still and quiet, and after what felt like an eternity, maybe it was just 20 minutes, the footsteps resumed. I could no longer hear the breathing, and slowly the heavy thuds of the footsteps receded into a nearby patch of forest which led into another property. After that experience, I couldn't sleep properly for the rest of the trip, and when I asked Ben the next day if he or anyone else was up and walking about by the window at that hour, he answered that the earliest person to get up was around 6 a.m. Of course, this would not be the last strange thing to occur. Fast forward a few years, and my sister was outside playing with two of her friends when suddenly 4 silhouettes began to move towards the gate of the farm. It's important to first highlight that the gate is a large structure which completely blocks the visibility of any person with the exception of their lower leg area. My sister saw 4 figures, all wearing white robes which dropped down to their feet. As she could recall, they walked in a synchronous manner to the gate, and then turned around to face it before then turning around and walking again in the same manner above. All it made her feel uneasy, and she quickly walked back to the main farm. Though it wasn't uncommon to see people walk past the gate since it faced the main road, the way these figures moved seemed almost machine-like in humanly synchronous steps, as the figures kept an equal distance from each other. Other than those encounters, other less directly involved strange things occasionally did occur, like in Milo, which seemed to have been completely torn apart, which we found in one of the grass fields. Our guest at the time was wild dogs, but even then that reasoning felt vague and lacking, especially because we'd never heard any wild dog packs in the area of our farm. Another strange sighting was made by a worker who came to the farm, who said that at around 5 a.m., he saw what he described as a monkey, a reasonably short primate-like animal with completely white fur, running on its hind legs at a considerably high speed from one patch of native forest to another. Now, I'm not that familiar with monkey species, but I know that for the most part New World monkey species do not run on their hind legs, especially at a distance of 100 m at least, and the speed akin to an experienced bipedal organism. Overall, what I find confusing is that many of these experiences are hard to connect. There does not seem to be a singular thing responsible, if you want to call it that. So what could it be? Some theories I like to think about relate to a native burial ground that was found right beside the farm building, which was left undisturbed, of course, but who knows who it belonged to, a powerful shaman. Perhaps could it be the source of some of these strange occurrences like the horsehair braiding? Personally, I think it goes beyond that. Like I said before, there was something chilling and uneasy about nightfall at that farm. Nothing was out of place or anything like that, but just the darkness itself felt strange, even if it was just a childish exaggeration at the time. Even now I'm pretty skeptic, but I always think about the occurrences at that farm whenever I hear about someone's own unexplainable stories, be it here on the channel or elsewhere. It could well be that these events were all part of my imagination. Let's face it, kids are way more easily scared, but I think even now, if I went back to that farm, I would still feel that uneasiness at night, and I would never camp outside in those fields. The Aurora Borealis from Wicker Orc 5434. A few months ago, when the Aurora Borealis was predicted to be visible in the vicinity of around where I live, I decided it would be fun to go on a small road trip with my cousin and aunt. We got ready at their house and set off at around 12:30 a.m. The car ride felt longer than it actually was. We entertained ourselves by listening to music. The drive was surrounded by mountains of tumble, weed and rocks, no civilization for miles. I love heading out there. Even now, the setting was perfect for seeing the Aurora Borealis. We were around the southwestern part of Idaho, dipping into northern Nevada. The weather was warm, but a slight breeze provided a colder feel. The pitch blackness outside added to the eerie ambience. We had explored various locations in that area before we've camped out there, stayed overnight in my aunt's car, searching for extraterrestrial life forms. We hiked and explored caves. We went thrifting in a small town that was a bit of a was. From there, my aunt was somewhat familiar with these surroundings. In contrast, my cousin and I are not exactly familiar with navigating around this area. We rarely used maps or any other navigational aids. But yeah, we've been out there many times before. As 3 at around 2:30 a.m., we arrived at a suitable location where we could pull over. My cousin had fallen asleep, leaving me and my aunt alone in the car. We were parked on the side of the road adjacent to a cutoff where half of the car, the side my cousin had been sitting on, in the front left, faced the cliff on the side of the road. I was on the right side in the back seat, oriented towards the road. After being out there for a couple of minutes taking photos, we began to hear this noise. It slowly faded in and got louder the longer we were out there. It was like someone was trying to hum a song, but like they had never heard one before. It sounded like a man, but also a woman at the same time. I'm struggling to describe it accurately, but it eerily evoked a sense of familiarity, though I couldn't pinpoint its origin. The noise seemed to come from my cousin's side of the car, which was unsettling because that's where the cliff was. My aunt initially assumed that I was the source of the sound, prompting her to repeatedly ask what. However, I was confused because I believed she was the one making the noise. When she heard me respond with what, at the same time as she heard the voice, she told me to get into the car. Immediately, she drove away while my car door remained open, my leg still dangling out the door. Whatever was making that noise was clearly no animal or person. In Idaho, it is said that there are small humanoid creatures that prey on humans called the nugger. It is said that sometimes they sing, and it echoes through the mountains. My only problem with this theory is that this legend is located in a completely different part of Idaho. If you look up something along the lines of Nugger Idaho dwarfs, you can learn more about this subject, but it's up to you to form your own opinion of the phenomenon. Though my aunt has stated she thinks it was a skinwalker, my cousin thinks we're being dramatic and stated that it was probably some sort of animal. The more I think about the story, the more unsure I am about what it could have possibly been. The Witch of the Maine Woods from Scar. I was a junior at the University of Maine when this happened about 8 years back. 2 friends and I, Charlotte and Isaac, decided to rent a cheap cabin near a small town called Glover's Creek. Our plan was to unwind for a long weekend. We picked that area because we'd heard rumors of a forest, which from colonial times we didn't really believe that, but we liked the idea of exploring local legends. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The cabin belonged to a man named Mr. Baines, who said very little. When we showed up, he handed us the key, watched us unload our car, and left. The place was old with worn floors and a stale smell. It had 2 bedrooms, a cramped kitchen, and a living area that barely fit the 3 of us. Still, we felt it was enough for a short stay. After we got settled, we drove into town for groceries. Glover's Creek was small, with a diner, a general store, and a tiny library. At the library, an older librarian gave us a polite greeting. She seemed curious about 3 college kids passing through. Charlotte asked if there were any local ghost stories or interesting historical events in the area. The librarian paused and said people sometimes spoke about a woman who supposedly vanished in the woods centuries back. Some folks believed her spirit roamed swamp in the forest preserve, calling out at night. The librarian had little else told, so we thanked her and left that evening. We sat around the cabin talking about the story. Charlotte was excited and wanted to go investigate. Isaac was cautious, though he admitted he was interested in the legends, but wanted to stay safe. We decided to go the next day to see this swamp for ourselves, maybe stay a few hours. After dark on Saturday, we drove down a dirt road into the forest preserve. The trees thickened as we went along, and the air felt damp. Eventually, we reached an area where the ground became muddy. We parked in a small clearing and hiked a narrow path, stepping over roots and trying not to sink into soft spots of soil. Before long, we arrived at a swampy area, still water surrounded by tall reeds and mossy logs. The place was quiet, with hardly any animal noises. We stood at the edge of the water. Charlotte tossed a pebble to see how deep it might be, and the ripples spread across the surface. Isaac wanted to come back later with a fire or a lantern, thinking we might see something if the ghost story was true. We all agreed to return at dusk, so we left, gather some supplies. Around sunset, we returned with a small camp lantern, a few snacks, and extra layers. We set up a basic site near the swamp, though we didn't plan on sleeping there. The temperature dropped quickly. We huddled around a makeshift fire pit, trying not to let the smoke bother us. At first it felt uneventful, just three friends talking about college, making jokes, occasionally shining a flashlight on the dark water. Close to midnight, we heard a splash from somewhere in the swamp. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. Isaac turned his flashlight in that direction, but the beam didn't reveal anything except more reeds. The surface of the swamp rippled. We stayed quiet for a few moments, waiting to see if it would happen again. Then there was another splash, followed by a faint noise I can only describe as a soft moan or sigh. Charlotte asked, "Did you hear that?" And we both nodded. We turned off the flashlight and waited. That's when something formed on the water. It was like a faint glow, roughly the shape of a person standing upright. It drifted above the water's surface, not on solid ground. We couldn't see a face or details, just the outline of a figure that seemed to move back and forth in a gentle swaying motion. The three of us froze. Charlotte grabbed my wrist and Isaac just stared. My heart was pounding, unsure if this was some trick of the light or something else entirely. Then we heard the moaning sound again, coming from that spot of light. It wasn't loud, but it seemed deliberate, almost like someone trying to speak but failing to do so. We could feel a chill in the air that didn't match the normal nighttime temperature in these parts. After about a minute or so, the figure receded like mist dispersing. We were left there in silence. None of us moved or spoke for some time, like we were waiting for it to come back. But nothing else happened. The water's surface returned to stillness. Charlotte whispered, "Let's leave," and Isaac agreed. I felt the same way. We quickly packed our things, doused the fire with water, and made our way back along the trail. The walk to the car was tense. I was startled by every little noise. I swear we didn't speak until we were all in the car with the doors locked. Isaac drove us back to the cabin, keeping quiet the entire ride. That night, none of us slept well. We left all the lights on in the cabin too. Charlotte wanted to talk it through, but Isaac and I had no idea how to explain what we'd seen. I said, maybe it was some natural phenomenon. I've heard people excuse such things as swamp gas or swamp bubbles or whatever, so maybe it was that. Something about the shape, though, and that low, moaning noise felt too real. By morning, we made a group decision to end the trip. We packed our bags, cleaned up the cabin, and wrote a brief note to Mr. Baines saying we had to go early. On the way home, we were all lost in our own thoughts. And that's the story of how we became believers of the Witch of M. How would you deal with a years-long Skinwalker problem? Face it heed in full force or and pretend it's not really there. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and you should follow me on X Dark Prevails, cause I found a cool feathery dinosaur video that you would love to see. Send me your scary stories at darkstories.org. Sign up to be a member at EerieCast, Complices for bonus content and more, and help us become the biggest and scariest show in the world by following and reviewing Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.